The film opens at a new ski resort in England, where we see two childhood best friends, Dan and Joe, show up with Dan's girlfriend Parker. They use Parker to flirt with a ski lift attendant and get 3 ski lift tickets for them at the price of 1. Parker follows their strategy and uses the damsel in distress trick to convince the attendant to give her 3 tickets for the price of 1. Now, she tags along with Dan and Joe on the ski lift. As the lifts slowly go up towards the snowy hill, the trio is seen talking nonsensically about others. Parker lights up a cigarette to calm her nerves, which indicates that she's afraid of something. Suddenly the resort faces some kind of power outage, which causes the lifts to stop mid-air. As their lifts are hanging onto a singular cable, they start to sway along with the strong gusts of wind, which triggers Parker's acrophobia since she's afraid of heights. Lucky for them, the power comes back on, and the lifts get in motion. They finally reach the mountaintop, where they have fun skiing. When it comes to skiing their way down the hill, Parker becomes scared and keeps hindering Dan and Joe's fun moments. The trio stops at a diner to eat for the day, where Joe clearly lets Dan know that Parker spoiled their skiing trip with her delicate nature. He persuades Dan to go for a second round, to which he agrees right away. Though Parker becomes skeptical of tagging along since the sun is setting soon. Dan convinces her to tag along, indicating signs of manipulation in the name of love. On their way out, Joe hits it off with a beautiful girl named Shannon. He asks her to write down her number for him, but Shannon states that she doesn't carry pens. Joe is confident that he has a strong memory, so he asks her to speak the number so he can memorize it. Once he does that, he leaves with Dan and Parker. By the time they march to the lifts, the sun has set and the sky has become dark. They still bug the attendant to turn the lifts back on, even though they can clearly see him closing down the lifts. At first the attendant warns them about an early predicted blizzard and refuses to let them take the lifts, but they persuade him to start the lifts for them. As their lift slowly goes up the hill, one of the resort's employees approaches the attendant to inform him of the ski owner's sudden plan to cancel his next week's vacation. The attendant clearly remembers getting his vacation approved due to his brother's wedding, so he starts to panic and leaves the place to straighten things out with the owner. He leaves the employee to close down the lifts once the rigid trio returns from the hilltop. The employee agrees and stands by the power source. He doesn't know what the trio looks like, so he mistakes them for another trio, which is seen skiing down the hill. After confirming their departure, he turns off the lift's power source. The attendant comes back and asks for an update. He also mistakes the second group for Dan's group and closes down the station for the night. Dan and his friends, who are still in the process of going up, become alert when their lift stops again. Only this time, they don't take it seriously, thinking that it's another malfunction that will get fixed on its own, not knowing that the lifts have been closed for the night. Now left alone to ponder for the night, Dan and Joe joke about their situation by comparing it with B-grade horror movie plots. Soon the resort also closes down, and all the employees depart for home for an entire week since the resort only opens on weekends. They kill the power before departure, which switches off all lights in the resort. The place suddenly becomes dark, which frightens the trio. They start assuming the worst-case scenarios since they know the resort will be closed for the next 5 days. Parker starts to scream in despair, but Dan keeps convincing her and Joe that someone will come to their rescue. Things get worse when the wind becomes strong and indicates signs of the arrival of a snow blizzard. They find themselves lucky when they spot a snowplow truck in the nearest distance. To get the attention of the man who is driving the truck, they collectively start to scream for help, but their noise is cancelled out by the loud storm. The trio thinks the driver has heard them, but in reality, he's only here to pick up a friend of his from the hill. He gets a radio from someone telling him to return, as his friend no longer needs the lift. The driver puts the truck in reverse and leaves the place. Dan and his friends start to scream at the top of their lungs and even throw their stuff down the lift to signal the driver, but the snow blizzard makes it hard for the driver to see their signs. Now the temperature drops to a point where everything starts to freeze, making the metal lifts colder. To distract themselves from reality, they indulge in nonsensical conversations again, but it doesn't help this time as they're slowly freezing to death. Parker and Joe plan to wait till the morning, hoping that someone might come to check up on the resort. Dan doesn't want to feed himself such delusions, so he decides to jump down from the lift and grab someone to help them. Parker advises him not to, as they're at an elevated point, but Dan estimates that he will be fine since the mountain is covered with soft snow. However, the consequences of his actions prove him wrong when he jumps down and breaks both of his legs due to the ice being stone hard. Dan convinces himself that he can crack the broken joints and get back on his feet, but the process brings him excruciating pain, due to which he gives up. Suddenly Joe spots a pack of wolves lurking in the mountain that are perhaps drawn by Dan's blood. Joe and Parker make Dan aware of them, which scares Dan to death. Joe takes back his words and tries to convince him that he's seeing small coyotes and not wolves. Parker also tells Dan to stay still and not show fear, as the wolves pick up on it. Park becomes extremely worried for Dan, so she convinces Joe to climb the cable and go all the way back to the pole at the station, from where jumping would be easier. Joe tries to climb the lift's metal structure to get to the cable, but since the metal has become frozen in the blizzard, Joe starts to slip on the icy structure. Hence he fails and returns on the lift. From there, he watches the wolves shred Dan to pieces and feast on his meat. Parker and Joe are both left traumatized by Dan dying a death as tragic as this. Parker breaks down in tears and blames Joe for the hideous idea of making a second round on the lifts. Joe gives Parker the emotional support and tells her to prioritize their safety over Dan's, who has been finished off by the wolves by now. Sometime later, they stop blaming one another and calm themselves down. Joe lets Parker know that the cable cut through his gloves when he attempted to climb it, which is why he can't make a second attempt. In no time, Dan's obliterated corpse gets covered with a thick layer of ice as it is constantly snowing. When Joe comes to his senses, he recalls memorizing Shannon's number. Sadly, he doesn't have a phone with him, so he plans on calling her later and marrying her if he survives this. Soon, Joe and Parker run out of topics to talk about and fall asleep in the freezing cold. When Parker wakes up the next morning, she finds a hard layer of ice over her hand, which has bound her hand with the metal rod. She tries to release the hand's grip, but it doesn't work. When she asserts strength, her palm gets peeled off and remains glued to the frozen rod, which makes her scream out loud. Her scream wakes up Joe, who immediately becomes concerned to see a thin layer of ice frozen on Parker's face. Parker lets him know that his face has become frozen too. Now slowly freezing away, Joe hopes that someone from their school will acknowledge their absence and come looking for them. Parker tells him to quit hoping, as they told no one about their ski trip. Upon realizing he's doomed, he starts screaming for help. No human life is spotted in the nearest distance. Hence, their cries for help go in vain. He decides to help himself and make a second attempt at climbing the cable, but Parker reminds him that he has a wound in his palm from the previous climbing attempt. She encourages Joe to sit for a little while as the sun has come out to suppress the cold. As time passes, Parker urinates while being stuck on the lift, so she starts crying out of embarrassment. With time, Parker and Joe start to get sunburned since they're stuck at an elevated spot where they come in direct contact with the UV rays. Joe doesn't judge her for that and waits for the sun to set low. Joe starts liking Parker more as she's his only company for days. They talk about several things and start to like one another. When it starts getting cold again, Joe makes his second attempt at climbing the cable. This time, a bolt is set loose from their lift, which causes their lift to lean on one side of the cable. Parker fears that she will fall along with the lift, but Joe yells at her to stay still. This time, Joe succeeds at climbing the rope and getting on the lift near the pole. Since the hard part is done, he moves on to climb down the pole, the easiest part. However, it becomes impossible for him to climb down as he spots a famished wolf waiting for his arrival. Joe asks Parker to throw him his ski rod so he can defend himself against the wolf. Poor Parker has grown weak by now, so when she throws the rod, it doesn't make it far. Instead, it falls on the icy ground. Joe refuses to spend another night in the cold, so he musters the courage to climb down the pole. He immediately gets attacked by the wolf, who munches on his arm. Joe shows courage and drags himself near the rod, using which he scares away the wolf. He promises Parker to get help for her and goes down the hill on his ski. Parker spots more wolves behind him, so she screams at him and lets him know. Now, Joe gets out of her sight, so she keeps waiting for him and hopes for his return. She starts to lose consciousness as the sunny day turns into a chilly night. There are still no signs of Joe, so she stops hoping for his return. She wakes up the next day with several blisters formed over her face due to the cold, and her lips turn cold blue due to a possible case of pneumonia. She decides to help herself and makes a jump, during which her lift breaks and falls. Miraculously, it hangs 2 feet above the ground, holding on to a thin rope, which allows Parker to land safely on the ground. Sadly, the rope breaks, and the lift falls over her ankle, ultimately breaking it. Now crawling, she glides down the hill where she encounters the wolves. The wolves have had their stomachs full by feasting on Joe, so they don't hunt Parker. She safely glides down the hill and nearly faints on the road, where she's found by some tourists. As they give her a ride back to town, the film ends.
Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe for more awesome recaps.